with 2 million acres of land confiscated by local authorities over the last 2 years alone, with homelessness, with so many problems arising from these policies. We are not surprised that refugees are flooding out of Burma and have been in different waves over the years. Currently, it's not known exactly how many are out there. I spoke to people at the Malaysian mission, for example, and they estimated that over 100,000, even though other written, the resolution 418 says 15,000. So I think in some countries it's not known how many. Of course, there's a huge number in Bangladesh from earlier waves, and there are many in Thailand and in other countries too. So talking about the refugees, the boat people, those who don't drown on the way, those who aren't pushed back, as happens in Bangladesh, pushed back by their government back to possible death in Burma. It's a huge issue. And Jenna Capeci from American Jewish World Service has been Director of Asia Programs, though I understand you have a slightly different role, so I'll turn it over to you.
So I came to Burma actually about 15 years ago, starting work with an organization based on the Thailand-Burma border called Earth Rights International. And since then, I've just been really passionate about the situation in Burma. I've met so many incredible, courageous activists, and I think it's a thorny, complicated country, but it's it's fascinating, and I think the struggles are really intense, and something that I'm really glad to be on this panel calling for more international attention on what's happening with the Rohingya community particularly. But just to give you a little sense of the context, because I think it's very important to understand the context of the country, I recall very early on when I was working primarily with an inter-ethnic group of activists from Burma, I was looking for someone to teach me Burmese, and not one person wanted to teach me Burmese. Because it was the language of the oppressor. And basically, the ethnic minorities, religious minorities of the country have been exposed to deep oppression, 50 years of violence and conflict in many of the ethnic nationality areas. So you can't underestimate, I think, the lack of trust that the people of Burma have in their government. So basically, briefly, it was a military dictatorship since 1962, and I'm sure you all know that recently, since 2010, the government initiated political reforms, and currently it's in a transition to democracy. And in the beginning, people were talking about change and excited and hopeful and wanted to see what change was going to come. And I think that based on the last 2 years, there's a lot more agreement amongst activists that the change is not positive. And it's pretty clear that the reforms are in word only, not in action. So there's a few indications, I think, that the country is still struggling to transition from war to peace, to transition from an armed authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, or a democratic government. And one is that conflict still rages on in the north, in Kachin state, as Nason U had mentioned. Also in western Burma, in Rakhine state, there's conflict. In both of those areas, there's over 100,000 people internally displaced. Even last month, the Burma army stepped up attacks in the north, places where they're theoretically trying to negotiate ceasefires, but the war continues. The ceasefires that are in negotiation, it's been years and they're still in negotiation, so there hasn't been much progress made on that front. With respect to political prisoners, the president committed to releasing all political prisoners by the end of last year, and actually released quite a few and then arrested some more. So basically what you're seeing happening in the country is people being arrested, farmers, people who are primarily countering land confiscation, as Adam mentioned, activists who are taking to the street, being arrested under the peaceful assembly and peaceful procession law. Basically, that law states you have to get permission from the authorities. An activist, Naon La, was arrested a couple months ago, and She was arrested for not getting permission. She asked for permission and didn't get it. And when she didn't get it, she said, I'm going to protest anyways. So these are the kind of activists who are being put in jail by the government. The violence and discrimination against the Rohingya, it's been 1.5 years since the initial violence. There are still over 100,000 people displaced. You heard a bit about the terrible humanitarian situation in that area of the country. With Doctors Without Borders being expelled, it's particularly dire. There's also, for those who are interested, a partner of ours, Fortify Rights, recently released a report that documents the persecution of the Rohingya and the way in which it's actually state policies undergirding this repression. So that's something, if you want more information, you can come and speak with me. I think another challenge that we're facing, particularly those of us who've been active for a long time on Burma, is that the international community doesn't want to hear that the reforms are not going well. So activists who used to have allies in the State Department in the US or with the EU or other members of the international community are finding that, they're hearing, well, I think things are getting better, and you were in exile, you don't understand the true situation. So I think that it's a particularly difficult time for activists trying to keep the international community aware that things are not actually getting better in the country of Burma. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the challenges that are happening and the pieces that we're seeing, the things that we're seeing that's happening that's good, what some of the community groups are doing to try to build peace and trust. So first, I think beyond the anti-Muslim attacks and anti-Muslim sentiment that's being spread by the 969 campaign, you also have the potential for violence to spread with other ethnic states. A colleague of mine who's based in the country said that there's actually a Facebook campaign that's going on in Shan State that's has the same kind of language, talking about the Pa'o ethnic minority, saying don't boycott Pa'o businesses. So I think that there's a potential, because the society is so divided and fractured because of the military regime, for this communal violence to spread and for more violence to spark in the country. The other piece I think that's important to mention is that with so many people having been in exile for many years, there's also a struggle over who gets to speak for the country, who's authentic or legitimate. So groups that have been in the border and have kind of returned to the country are also struggling with their own legitimacy. So one of the things to note around this nationalism the Buddhist nationalism, Burman nationalism that's happening in the country is that it's not really new. It's been a state policy. The military junta has had discriminatory practices and policies against pretty much anyone who's not Burman, which is the majority group Buddhist, in the country. And it's been, there are a couple of key examples. The army used rape against ethnic women as part of its Burmanization strategy. It's been well documented by human rights groups. Schools in ethnic areas could not teach their own ethnic languages or promote their own culture. Individuals who are not Burman or Buddhist were often found it hard to find jobs within the state or employment in the state. And I think that what I find really disheartening is the institution of Buddhism, which has, in the 2007 Saffron Revolution and in so many ways was calling for human rights democracy, has now, because of some of these extremist leaders, like Wiratu, become enmeshed with these repressive policies of the state. So they've become very nationalist. They have this 969 campaign that's talking about how Buddhism is under attack by Muslims, and they're trying to get the public to be afraid. And what you hear in the general public are fears that the Muslim population is growing, and that terrible stereotypes that they have many wives, many children, they're going to take over the whole country. There are sometimes moments where you hear people who are talking about human rights principles as an excuse, saying, oh, well, we're afraid that they repress women. We're speaking out for women's rights when we talk about how the Muslim community is bad. So there's a lot of hate speech and stereotypes that are being used, and also social media. Videos are being circulated that show people who are dressed up as Muslim beating other people up to try to get the general public even more, how would I say it, to just get them riled up. So what are some of the things that people are doing in the country? I mean, obviously, there are a lot of activists who are speaking out against violence, who are trying to promote peace in their communities. So I have just a few examples. I think one thing that we've seen is that bringing people together in informal ways is an initial step to trust building. Right now, I think that it's really on the basic level just starting to build trust. I mean, we hear from folks that they've never met a Rohingya person because, as you heard, Rohingya are so restrained and constrained and restricted, they're not actually allowed to leave their communities. So bringing people together, even in like an English class, there's a organization called Women Peace Network, Rakhine, that's hosting English classes of people from all different faiths and ethnicities, and it's just giving people an opportunity to get to know each other. And this activist was telling us that even just showing up at a civil society meeting in Yangon saying, I'm Rohingya, and putting a face to the name of a group of people that have been dehumanized has been transformational. I think another example, you heard about the interfaith marriage law, the draft law that prohibits Buddhist women from marrying people who are not Buddhist, requiring that men convert to Buddhism. Women's rights groups have been very vocal about this law and how it is against human rights principles, and how it's also not in accordance with peaceful coexistence of all faiths. They're also accusing the government of trying to distract people in the lead up to the 2015 elections. So I think that this is an area where women's rights coalitions across multiple ethnicities and religions have come together to offer progressive voice, which is very important. A third piece is, as you heard, the importance of bringing together religious leaders in the country. And I think, the International Network of Engaged Buddhism has done some work in Southeast Asia and is really working to try to bring together progressive, or if they're lacking progressive leaders, to bring together moderate leaders from the different faiths. Other pieces, the first piece is bringing people together. I think the importance of data and evidence is key, because so much of this is misinformation. There's a lot of rumors going around the country of what really happened, and the government is denying a lot of these violent attacks. So it's incredibly important to actually get information out from from these communities, but also to use historical records to counter these claims that all of the Rohingya are recent immigrants, which isn't true. There are records, there are public records, there are records, Archbishop state has records, there are old censuses that show that's not true. So I think that that's another key piece. The third piece is just a note that because it is so politicized, and because in local communities monks are very, very revered, it's been challenging for progressive civil society leaders to speak out against the 969 campaign. And so it's also been very important for them to be diplomatic and strategic about the way in which that they criticize these propaganda campaigns. And there's also, overlaid with it, is there is a perception of bias from the international community. So interestingly enough, folks who were talking about the interfaith marriage law and how it's against human rights and it shouldn't be written into law, were called they're called stooges of the international community. So I think it's a delicate balance in the way in which local organizations are speaking about this smear campaign and violence. And one last piece is just that we've seen that youth are particularly active. During the 969 campaign, there was a sticker campaign, and youth put together their own stickers that talked about the non-discrimination and talked about we are all from Burma, we are all part of this country. They're doing street performances. There's creative ways in which they're kind of creating space for dialogue in their communities. So I think that supporting youth organizations and some of these creative activities are important. The last point would be just to echo my colleague that it's really important to continue to exert diplomatic pressure on Myanmar and the government, and to make sure that the political reforms actually are more about action than words, which they have been to date. That's all. Thanks.
Just to make sure, American Jewish World Service also works with refugees, I think, right?
We do, yes, we do. We primarily, we've worked in the area, in the region since 2002. We work primarily with refugees on the Thailand-Burma border, but we currently are not working with refugees in Malaysia or in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Yeah.